Hey guys, Anna from girlsonkey.com. We do videos and podcasts about poetry for you guys. Today's podcast is a focus on New Zealand poet Paula Green. Hi everyone, Anna from Girls on Key. Today's podcast is an interview I did with Paula Green from New Zealand. She has a new book coming out shortly called Wild Honey, Reading New Zealand Women's Poetry. So it's coming out this year. So here's a little bit about Paula. So Paula Green is a poet, blogger from the New Zealand Poet Shelf and Poetry Box. She's an anthologist and a children's author. She received the 2017 Prime Minister's Award for Poetry and was made a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit for services to poetry and literature. She's published and edited over 15 books, including 99 Ways into New Zealand Poetry with Harry Ricketts and Dear Heart, 150 New Zealand Love Poems. Her latest poetry collections include New York Pocketbook, The Letterbox Cat and Other Poems, and of course Wild Honey, Reading New Zealand Women's Poetry, which will be out later this year. So here's an excerpt from an interview I did with Paula in 2016 around the time of the Auckland Writers' Festival, so I hope you enjoy.
Hi Paula, thanks for agreeing to do this interview today. Tell me a bit about how you started in poetry, because I know that you've studied Italian. What sparked your interest in poetry?
Well, I've always written since I was little, and from before I went to school, I would write in my father's books in his study, and so in the end they had to put books on the lower shelf where I could write, which was just indecipherable, but I felt like I was doing something, engaging. And then I just went on this, I developed a writing life from an early age, and I think there were kind of key things that happened to me when I was in year 8. My teacher was a poet, Form 2, and so that was quite marvellous, and he really allowed my writing to flourish. And he's actually in Big Smoke, which was, quite interesting as an adult to pick up Big Smoke.
Yes.
And see my intermediate teacher, who is actually now untraceable, no one knows where he is, and he had a really exotic name, Frederick Palme, with 2 E's on the end and an accent.
Yeah.
So I think it was wonderful.
So was he from New Zealand?
No, but I didn't. I mean, you don't know the history of your intermediate school teachers, do you?
No, that's right. Yeah, those formative years are it's interesting how they can have an impact, isn't it?
And then when I hit high school, my high school English teachers were not that good, and so they didn't contribute much to my writing life. 2 things happened to me, and one of them was I discovered the poetry of Hone Tufare, which was liberating and showed you what words can do in so many different ways. And like Hone can leap high and kind of leap low. So I loved everything and all the bits in between. James K. Baxter came to our secondary school. I was in the 6th form. And he stood on the stage in his scruffy clothes, with his scruffy beard and bare feet. It was it was 1972, so it was hippie time, and he had long scruffy hair. And then when he opened his mouth and he read, and this would never happen now. This was to the whole school. Now when I visit a secondary school, it's to one class in year 11 and one class in year 12, but this was the whole school in the hall. And I would say the majority of the students were kind of looking out of the window and catching the odd phrase, but I was just hooked. It was like an epiphany. It was just so transporting for me. And so I went home, I hid his book, Jerusalem Sonnets, and I just wrote in the manner of James K. Baxter, which just seems ludicrous that this 17-year-old girl in Whangarei writing in the manner of James K. Baxter.
Yes.
Meantime, sort of loving Hone. But then 7 days later, he was dead, and so it was just like heartbreak for me. But it kind of, I don't think I consciously said I want to be a poet, but I knew that I wanted to write, and that whatever I did, I wanted to write. And there's this famous story about the some film directors in Italy called the Taviani brothers, who one day went to the cinema. Somehow they scraped some money, sat in this dark, intimate space, looked up on the screen and saw this film, and they just saw their life reflected on the film by a director who was giving them their world, and they just said cinema or death. And I just felt with James K. Baxter, I don't think I said poetry or death, but I know, and he wasn't entirely reflecting my world back to me as a 17-year-old girl, adolescent, in Northland, but I knew that it was poetry or else, And so from then on, every choice I made, writing was a significant part of it, whether it was, teaching or travelling the world, whatever. So that's how I went on. And I ended up going to university at a late age and loving it so much that I just kept saying, I'll go back for another year. I'll go back into another degree. And I stayed there until there were no more degrees. And I think what it did for me, I was actually hearing some people talk about doing a PhD last night and why they were doing it. And I did my degrees out of love of writing. It gave me the time and the privileged space to work in a world of ideas and to write.
Yes.
And I wasn't to go up an academic ladder to make more money. It was out of the love of writing.
Yes. And tell me a bit about from Cookhouse through to your latest collection, which is the Baker's Thumbprint.
Yeah.
Tell me about your progression through those books.
Well, Cookhouse I wrote when I was at university, and I guess that gave me the reputation for being a somewhat difficult poet. And I was at that time really in love with American women poets such as Susan Howe, Lisa Robertson, those kinds of women, Anne Carson and so on. Cookhouse was far more challenging and demanding than I think my latest books are. But I actually think that every poetry book I write is an autobiography, but in a different shape, different form. But whether it's fashionable or unfashionable, it becomes another version of my life. But at the same time, I only say so much, and I keep most of my life private. I'm not prepared to share that much of it, but at the same time, it's always some kind of autobiographical version of something that's happening.
Yes, and my favourite one is Making Lists with Frances Hodgkins. And so the role of art, obviously art plays a large role in your life. Tell me a bit more about that.
That's interesting, because that's kind of like in the middle of my collection, that book. And there's always a kind of starting point for a book, a launch pad. And for that book, I felt like I was in an episode of House, and I had a mysterious illness, and I ended up in hospital, and no one knew what was wrong with me. It transpired that I'd had an extreme reaction to an antibiotic. Oh gosh. Yeah, and so I couldn't eat or do anything for quite a long time, maybe a year. And to start with, I could just have sips of juice, and once I was out of hospital, I was invited to write a poem to read in the middle of the Frances Hodgkins exhibition that was going to be mounted in Auckland. And so I just said, okay, here I am lying in bed, I'm able to move, able to eat, and I thought, I'll do it. So, and at that point, I was really ambivalent about the work of her, and I didn't particularly like it. So I got Michael to bring me all these books with her art, and I just lay in bed looking at the paintings. And the more I looked, the more I fell in love with them. And I decided that I would write my way in and out of her paintings.
Wow, that's cool. Your partner Michael's an artist as well. If you saw a beautiful landscape and you were told you have to write a poem, how would you approach that? What's your approach to looking at this landscape?
If I were told to write a poem of that landscape, for example, I was commissioned to write a poem which is kind of like a slightly one-step removed landscape to go with Colin McCann's big walking painting, which is on show in Te Papa at the moment.
Right.
So I was commissioned to write a poem for it, and that painting is from Muriwai, which is just down the road from me. And so I decided, well, I'm not going to write a poem exactly about that painting or exactly about that beachscape, but I'm just going to use the starting point of me walking on Beagle's Beach. And so that was my starting point, and then I had no idea how the film was going to turn out. I didn't think I'm going to write a sonnet or I'm going to get my ear working so it's a musical poem. I just launched myself into it.
And so being open to that mystery of what's going to unfold. And I think that comes across to the reader too, because you take us to surprising places often in your work, so I think that really comes across.
Well, thank you. I really, really strongly feel that there is no paradigm for poetry. I mean, there are models that you can explore and love and dislike and reject and so on, but there are quite a lot of didactic statements about poetry. A poem ought to, it ought to tell a story. A poem ought to be mysterious or musical or whatever, and also there are people, particularly in reviews, who claim this is a poem that's not a poem, whereas I never do that. And I think that if something's been put in a book and that book is clearly a book of poetry, then I'm not going to question the status of whether that thing on the page is a poem or not. I'm going to delve into it and try and explore it on its own terms, and at the end of it I might think, well, it doesn't work for me, or it's not my cup of tea, but I'm not going to discredit it as not poetry, because to me that's setting up unfortunate limits.
Yes, and what about the recent discussion around the performative aspect of spoken word and poetry? Do you want to weigh in on that at all, or I mean, it's an old debate, but
yeah,
because you've performed a little bit, I know, but
yeah, well, I'm not a performance poet, but I do love reading my poetry, and I do like memorising poems too. But I do think that some people reject performance poetry without really retuning their ear into what's going on. And I think it's really wrong to sit in front of a performance poet and view it through the lens of traditional poetry on the page, because I think what's happening here is something quite different. So if you look at a performance by Tusiata Avia, which transports you and leads you into all kinds of different places, it's like watching opera. You have a multiple experience. And so if you sit in front of opera, or if you like opera, if you don't, it will be a disaster, but if you like opera, your body starts to move and tingle. You feel the hairs on your arms standing on end, and your body moves, and your heart starts beating faster. And so the first thing is that the performance poet is going to hit your ear. And if you listen to a good performance poet, they are taking charge of the breath, of the musical notes, rhyme that just cuts right through you because it's so sweet, or sharp, or discordant. There are all different kinds of harmonies and discords going on. So this is when it's good. I mean, like all poetry, it can be good and it can be bad, and a bad performance poetry is, it's dreadful. And then, so you've got that. The first thing is you've got your body responding at the level of music, and then a good performance poet will take you on other journeys, and it might be political because there might be strong ideas, forcefully sometimes, addressed in the poem. Then there might be ways in which that piece comes from the heart, so there might be emotional themes. So like Grace Taylor, for example, has a number of poems that have really hooked my heart into theatre. That you're just moved by it. So it's a kind of like full package experience. And I don't think you should be relating it in terms of what James K. Baxter does, or
And there's also the transience as well of the performative art. Yeah, so it's an interesting. It's a whole different art form in a way.
To me, it's organic, because I don't know that any performance would ever be exactly the same, and that's quite glorious, because in a way it's a bit like reading a poem. If you sit down and read, a poem that you liked in the Frances Hodgkins book, the next day you read it, your reading of it will, that's basic reader theory, it will shift and change.
Yes, and it shifts, in a different way to when you're sitting experiencing a performance, and there's that theatrical aspect. Yeah, it's great, isn't it? And I think as well, poetry is quite a wide banner of over a whole art form. So there is such a spectrum, isn't there?
Usually, when you read a book of poetry, it's a private experience. It's intimate. It's you and the page. But when you are at a performance poetry event, it's like it's very kind of community strengthening, and like that person said, everyone's clicking their fingers, and okay, they're clicking their fingers, but it kind of strengthens the poetry community, and there's a real kind of acknowledgement, a real attentiveness as to what your peers are doing, and I just think that's truly wonderful.
That shared experience. Fantastic. And I know that you also do, so you're an editor and you do anthologies, what else, reviewing. If you had to choose, all of the things that you do, if you lined them up and you were only allowed to do one, what would it be? And for children or adults? Like what's your preference?
Both.
Yeah. And tell me a bit about the difference in approach when you're writing for children as opposed to when you're writing for adults.
Whenever I write, and I've been thinking about it because I've just started writing a new book, and I've had reviews of my most recent book, and there've been some critical points on them. So you have them in your head buzzing around like little nagging bees, thinking, oh, what should I do about that? So you have to get through that, and the way to get through those buzzing bees is to just get writing, and you write through the swarm, and then they're gone, and you're in that writing zone again. That's what you do. But I was thinking about the whole idea of voice, and that, you do find your voice, and I think I found my voice, and this is it. This is who I am, and, at the end of the day, it's what I love to do more than anything. So I want to write this thing that I'm loving, and of course I'll craft it, and I'll reflect on it, and I'll leave it, and I'll go back to it. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to compromise what I love in order to get published. So I would rather not be published. I would rather not be having to shape something for a market. I will write what I love. So that's what I do as an adult writer. When I'm writing for children, I have a slightly different approach, and I write for children, and my study fills up with children, and I test out my poems on children. I go into my poems for children, but it's got to infect them, so that, it's like that whole thing of being told stories when you're little. The sounds worm into your head, you feel comfortable, excited, amused, whatever. You go on a whole kind of gamut of emotional journeys, reactions. That's what I want my poems to do. So sometimes I might want to write a poem that's going to make a child cry, or ponder and puzzle, and be stumped and stormed. But primarily I want my collection to just delight in a sense of play of words, so that when a child picks up that book, they want to read it. Not because their teacher tells them to, or their parent tells them to, but because they want to. More than anything in the world, they want to have that fun and play.
And so tell me some stories about when you've connected with some kids have really connected with your work.
When I started testing out the poems for Macaroni Moon, which is my book of when I started trying to write funny poems, and I read them out to a school, and they laughed, and I was shocked, because I have written a few things in my adult collections where people laugh, particularly at the back of Making This with Francis Hodgkins. And I've got these pieces that people laugh, but I'm quite unused to it. So the children were laughing, and I was quite surprised. So that was really pleasing. And then I've also got a poem where I've written it about, I turned the tables on people being cruel. I witnessed people being cruel to an orangutan at Auckland Zoo. So I turned the tables, and in my poem, I've got people paying to come to my house and be cruel to me, throw things through my window and all that. And so I tell them the story and then I read them the poem, and the whole school, their face was really sad, and sometimes there might be a tear, and I just say, this is what poetry can do, because when I saw this event, I was angry and upset, and I wasn't sure what to do. So what I did was I wrote a poem, and then that gives me the chance to talk about it with you. So it goes on that little trip.
And so, just thinking about that idea of art and poetry as catharsis, do you find that is the case for you, or these events in your life kind of outworking themselves through poetry?
I don't know that it is. I mean, because I've written Slipstream, which comes out of a cancer experience, so you could think of it as that, but really, I do it after the fact, a few years down the track, when that's no longer. No, I do it. It's kind of a reflective thing, and I think any kind of emotional intensity has dissipated. So, but interestingly, with Slipstream, I didn't ever think of each thing on the page as a poem, and in fact, I never gave it a title. I never gave each piece on the page a title, because I never thought they were worthy of a title. But I felt the whole thing together would form some kind of poetry. Wasn't much what, but yeah.
Is that the closest you've come to a long poem? What's your longest poem that you've done?
Well, that's a long poem, definitely. So that's a whole book. And I guess most of my other books have been quite thematic. Yeah.
Any tips for people that wanted to write poetry?
I would say don't be bound by rules. Rules, you can break any rule in poetry, and there is no given. And I think it's really good to try writing outside your comfort zone. And it's also good to recognise the growing strength of your own voice and have confidence in it. I think it is. And if you look across a cross-section of New Zealand poetry, it's quite a diverse community.
Yes.
And I don't think that we can say there is one particular kind of writing in this country. I think it's eclectic, and I think that's good. I don't think that anywhere, whether it's Victoria or anywhere, is promoting one kind of writing.